for those of you who are not students. And welcome also to tonight's event, Money, Market, or Mission, Museums in a Changing World. Now, this event is organized by the Master's Program in Museum Professions, as well as by the Institute for Museum Ethics. And financial support has been provided by the Robert Lehman Foundation through the Edwin Weisel Lecture Fund and by the Center of Excellence at Seton Hall University. And we thank both of these organizations very much for their financial support. And I also want to thank, as always, our great graduate students, Alyssa, Elizabeth, and Emily, who of course do all the work, and whenever I get nervous and frustrated, they calm me down, and that was always a useful thing to do. So I'm now calling on Jackie Bowen, who is a member of the Institute of Museum Ethics Student Advisory Committee, and she will introduce Sally Yerkovich, and Sally will then introduce Judith Dobrzynski.
Hey everybody. So Sally Yerkovich is the director of the Institute of Museum Ethics here at Seton Hall, and she's a consultant to numerous nonprofit and educational organizations. She has an MA and a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania, and she has over 25 years of leadership experience in high-profile American institutions, including places such as the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, New Jersey Historical Society, and more. Since 1996, Dr. Yerkovich has also worked with leaders of cultural organizations in Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, sharing best practices, encouraging interactive learning in informal settings, and promoting social justice. She has served on the board of the American Association of Museums and the U.S. Committee for the International Council of Museums, and was the president of the Council for Museum Anthropology and the Fund for Arts and Culture. Her interest in ethical practice dates from her work in the National Endowment for the Humanities, where she helped to draft the Code of Ethics in the early days of her career, when she helped draft the guidelines for Native American projects at the National Endowment for the Humanities. So I'd like to welcome her up to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Is this working? Hello. Oh, great. It's working. Thanks, Jackie. It's great to see so many people here tonight, and we're proud to be part of the celebration this year of the 20th anniversary of the Seton Hall's Museum Professions program. This is the second of a series of 3 programs that celebrate the 20th anniversary. The first was our program in January, where Nina Simon talked about her approach to revitalizing the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. And the third program will be in next fall, where James Cuno, who's president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust in California, will speak. Tonight, we have the opportunity to talk with Judith Dobrzynski and about in the museum, how museums are or are not changing. Judith is an award-winning journalist, and she writes primarily now about arts and culture. She's published regularly in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Smithsonian, Forbes, the Daily Beast, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune, among others. Her blog, called Real Clear Arts, is about culture and culture in America, and appears regularly on artsjournal.com. Judith also, and perhaps even more relevant for this evening, Judith also was the editor of the New York Times Sunday Business section and the deputy business editor of the Times. She was a senior editor of Business Week and the executive editor and managing editor of CNBC, the cable television business network. What more perfect person could we find to talk about money, markets, or mission, museums in a changing world? We're going to start tonight's conversation with a reference to the recent discussions we've had at Seton Hall. last year, we heard from Arnold Lehman, the director of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And this year, we heard from Nina Simon, director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. Both claim to be leading revolutions of sorts. They were using new strategies to bring people into the doors, not just for the purpose of bringing people in, but also for the purpose of, or motivated by the need to raise additional money. The idea of getting more people and more diverse audiences into museums seems to be linked in many conversations with fundraising and with raising additional funds for the museum. Whether this is a legitimate sort of linkage or not is something that we can talk about further. When we asked Arnold Lehman last year about the effectiveness of his work, he has managed to get huge numbers of people to come to special evening events, dance parties, and things of that sort at the Brooklyn Museum. But when he was asked about if there's any spillover between the people who come on weekends and people who then come back to the museum, he admitted that there really wasn't, that was the toughest part of getting people to come to the museum. Is you could get them to come for some things, but you couldn't necessarily get them to come for others, as in going to exhibitions. Again, when we asked Nina Simon the same question in January, whether people coming to their Friday night events actually come back to their galleries, she admitted that the jury's still out on that they've just begun to start to do evaluation to see what impact the Friday night events have. So if as many pundits say on blogs, in newspapers, wherever, that museums need to change to meet the changing times, museums need to come up with new ways of raising money, and build and diversify their audiences, one of the questions that we wanted to start out talking about is, are these the models that we need to emulate? Is the idea of bringing in people for special events, for parties, for dance events, for art making events in the evenings, is this something that is both going to build audiences and give museums more sources of revenue? So with that, I'm going to hand you the microphone.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to say how pleased I am to be here, and thank you all for inviting me. I hardly know where to begin, Sally, with what you have started us off with. There's so many issues involved there, but let's just start with a few. The connection between building audiences and money. It's overdrawn, to say the least. As probably some of you know who've looked at museum financial models, at the best of museums, where there is a large tourist component, like at the Met, for example, the gate only brings in something like 8 to 10% of revenues. Now, I will grant you that audience drives revenues from the shop, from restaurants, and from other peripheral activities like that for earned income, but it's still a very small component of a museum's overall budget. So I think, to say the least, the getting audience to get money is overdrawn. I think also, motivation, and where this becomes an ethical issue, for me at least, is the motivation behind the drive for audiences. Because museums, to me, are at least art museums, that's what I'm talking about here, but you could substitute collections for other museums. The main focus should be on the art. That's the core mission. And when you stray from that, I think motivation becomes why you're doing it might become an ethical issue. I think I wasn't here for Nina Simon's event, but I know the Brooklyn Museum a little bit better, but I think when you look at when you combine the attendance for Friday night or Target First Saturdays or some of the evening events and use that as indicative of your museum attendance, it's very misleading. For one thing, they're not there for the art, and for another thing, if museums were open in the evenings when they have most of those events that we're talking about, they might actually get more people into the galleries. But if you look around the country at how many museums are open at night when people who are working could actually go to the museums, it's maybe one evening a month. I don't think there's a rule, that all museums must be open on Friday and Saturday nights. I think it really varies from community to community. Some cities really are not, don't have the culture of going out to a museum at night, and it would take a very long time to change habits. I'm sure you know how long it takes to change habits. But there are other places where the museum's own attendance in the galleries would benefit from evening hours. And I think that's where some of the Arnold Lehman and Nina Simon numbers, again, exaggerate what their actual attendance is, because if they're there to hear the band from 5 to 10 and it's free every Saturday night, or not every Saturday night, but every Saturday night you're open, is that really museum attendance or is that dance party attendance? And I haven't looked at it recently, but the Brooklyn Museum, a couple of years ago, I did look at it. On the 11 nights of Target First Saturdays, they got more than 20% of their attendance, just on 11 nights. And were any of them going into the galleries? Well, Arnold says a few, but I think even he admitted that not very many really go into the galleries. So what are you bringing the people to the museum for? Isn't it always supposed to be about the art?
Well, you mentioned when we were talking earlier about, and you mentioned it just now, habits, people's museum-going habits. And made some observations that I thought were interesting about the things that we did starting, 20 or 30 years ago to get people to come to museums, as in big exhibits, blockbuster exhibits.
Exactly. I think we have, let's face it, we do have habits, and museums, and not just museums, but entertainment, industry, lots of industries train us. They may not like to, or you may not like to see it that way, but basically what they market to you, the way they present things, they're training you to look for things. And beginning in the 70s and much more in the 80s and 90s, art museums trained people to come for special exhibitions. They didn't train them to come blockbusters, yes, but not even always blockbusters, special exhibitions. And now we're wondering why there's nobody in the permanent collection galleries. Well, we trained them not to go to the permanent collection galleries. We trained them to come for special exhibitions. And right now, I think you probably want to get into the story that I wrote in summer on experience museums. Right now, we're training people to come to museums for activities. Again, not for the art. It may involve the art, but it's the activity, the experience of being in an activity that we're training people to come to museums for now. And I think that's a very dangerous road to go down.
But that's not the only road that people are going down. That there, in fact, are some places that are training, that aren't training or whatever, attracting people to come to their museums because of their permanent collections. And in fact, one of the things I think that happened in the recent series of economic downturns is that museums began to think about how to bring people back to look at their collections rather than bringing in more expensive traveling exhibitions. One of your articles recently about the Worcester Museum of Art was particularly notable for that, because they have a new director who has just installed their permanent collections.
Yes, Matthias Wacek is his name. He's rapidly becoming one of my favorite museum directors. He came from the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts in St. Louis, which is a contemporary gallery, and his academic experience is in, as I recall, symbolism. But now he runs the Worcester Museum. How many of you have ever been to or know very much about the Worcester Museum? Okay, good. It's really a wonderful museum, an absolutely wonderful museum. It was he said that the founders started it as a mini Met, which they really couldn't be because they don't have really the resources in Worcester anymore to be a mini Met. But the founders founded it at a time when Worcester was a very big manufacturing center, and they had a lot of donors and rich people, and is this on? Yeah. And but that's all gone away. I mean, they were an industrial town, and now they're not. The population shrunk. Certainly, the donor base shrunk, and they're just close enough to Boston museums that people who really want to see, you know, the great special exhibitions, and sometimes the permanent collection will go see the MFA in Boston. And yet at the same time, they can't convince people in Boston to come visit them because the MFA Boston pretty much has what they have. Matthias arrived at the museum in 2011, and I want to dig out the numbers. He was totally honest. Why is this not on? Okay. He was totally honest, which many museum directors are not. And no, about attendance. I'm sorry. Let me make that clear. I was talking about attendance. Attendance when he arrived, well, in fiscal 2011, was 76,012. But he didn't care about that number. He cared about who was in the galleries. And at Worcester, it's kind of easy for him to tell who was in the galleries because the way their building is set up, or was particularly set up at the time, the entrance led one way to the galleries and another way to the education facilities, to the restaurant, to the other things. So you knew who was going, they could track who was going into the galleries and who was just going over to the restaurants and the shop and the other things. So when the total museum, which is pretty bad as it is, attendance was 78,000, the gallery attendance in the galleries was a pitiful, literally, 31,415 for the entire year. In a wonderful museum. You've seen it, Petra. Is it not a wonderful collection? Right. Great collection. So he arrived and he said, what am I going to do about this? Well, he did several things, and he also got lucky on several things. But one of the things he did was he remastered, which was he himself, because in the cutbacks they had laid off many of their curators and they didn't have any capacity. So he himself went through the old masters collection and remastered it. And he decided that one of the things that was very off-putting about museums today was the traditional installation of picture, label, picture, label, picture, label. When everybody's going through reading the labels, barely looking at the pictures. So what he did instead was use this medallion-style hanging, took away the labels. The labels, the information about the pictures, are now on cards, which are either in the center of the room or over on the side. He also provided iPads. I don't know whether we have the picture of the iPads in the gallery, so people can leave comments or write their own labels or do whatever they want. But the point was he used this medallion style to group paintings in a way that would get people to look at them. Now look at this, and he mixed sometimes. Those aren't all Spanish or Italian or whatever old masters. He would sometimes mix various countries, which wasn't typical in the past. This particular one, can you guess what is common in this grouping? Well, to him, and again, he fully admits that what he sees in them other people may not see them. But to him, this is all about the gaze. Every picture there there's interaction among the various people gazing, but the painting itself is about the gaze in some way or another, with the exception of this little predella down here, which he put there because he thought it looked like kind of like an altarpiece, and it looked right to him. But can we go on to the next one? Let's see. So there's, you can see it in another angle. And then he also, you can't see it here, but see in that green gallery, there's a painting there that's of a young, I think it's Dutch, and it's of a young boy. And opposite, on the other end of this, there's another green gallery, and it's in perfect dialogue with a very old woman and another Dutch painting. So he arranged all these paintings in a way to get people to actually look at the artwork. And he took away the distracting labels. And he did, can we get the next one? No, that's not the one. That's just some examples. No, the one with music. You did the one with music. Well, he got lucky on this. I'll tell you the story in a minute. Here. He also did some activities in the galleries that were related to the art. So it's not, you know, he realizes that it's not, you can't just hang things up there. Again, it's about changing habits, getting people to look at things. And programming is important to that. They also had lectures in there. There were some, one room that had more religious paintings than other, and he invited in preachers to preach in there in relation to the art. In any case, it proved, at least in the beginning, very successful. People came, they didn't like it all, they wanted their labels back for one thing, but at least it got people to look. And in the next fiscal year, I'll give you the number in a minute, attendance in those galleries was up, I think it was 70% to 53,493. Okay, he's still got a long way to go, and when I last spoke with him in January, he said it had plateaued, attendance had plateaued, it wasn't still rising as it was in the first year. But then Sally went on the website the other day and discovered that they're doing something with a slight contemporary touch, but also about the art. So again, to me, the importance here is that it is about the art. Oh, I have to give the little quote now. I used the quote because he's one of the few museum directors that I talk to that isn't afraid to speak like this publicly. He said, Sally, you tell about the contemporary thing while I find it.
Well, the photos that we just went by quickly are images from their website, where a lot of the paintings that have been rehung are there. You can find out more information about them, but again, they're in relationship with one another in really interesting ways. There's also, in the next page, there are places where the results of the iPads in the galleries can be seen, where you see a work of art, plus the comments that various people have left. And the people who leave comments are from all different professions, all different walks of life, and have very different and really interesting perspectives on art.
Okay, let me do this quote. I really don't hear this from many museum directors, and he was not the least bit embarrassed, and I didn't even use all of it. He said, I want people to fall in love with the art. When you fall in love with it, you think about something that is bigger than you are, bigger than your small world, bigger than what you are feeling at that moment. It goes to mankind. And then he said, actually, I want people to love art to bits, which I thought was really, effusive. It just showed his own enthusiasm for getting people interested in the art instead of just getting people in the door.
So do you think this is something that other museums should look to as a potential model for how to get people in?
I know that some of them already are looking to it. I don't think it's right for every museum. First of all, not every museum has the collections that Worcester has. And he was very lucky, as I said, because I think they borrowed from patrons, maybe 3 additional paintings, but everything else was in the collection. You can tell by the medallion style also he hung more. The hanging was more dense than it had been before because the style allowed him to do that. And while we're here, well, let's talk about this painting. This involves money too. He also realized, I mean, look, it's not just one thing. When you're going to try to change a museum and get more people there, it's not one thing, it's many small things. And one of the things he realized when he got there was that the board was not Worcester didn't have the donors that it used to have, and the board, he didn't have as many people on the board as he should have that might be able to give. And so he talked with his trustees, and particularly his chairman, about getting more people who could give on the board. And they did something which the chairman had collected old masters, and he, I think, suggested a woman, an old master dealer in New York named Rachel Kaminsky. And Matthias met her and liked her and put her on the board. Well, Rachel's stepmother, and I'm sure they knew this, but I didn't think they had any idea that this would happen, is a collector in New York named Hester Diamond, who's a very big old master collector, and among other things. And for you young people, she's also the mother of Mickey D, is that his name? He's a rock musician. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Anyway, all right, she is. Anyway, so Hester Diamond owned, among other things, this Veronese. And in honor of Rachel, her stepdaughter, she gave that painting to the Worcester Museum. Again, you can't make that up, right? I mean, you can't go seek somebody who's going to do that. But as I said, so he got lucky as well as being smart. But that's part of the whole thing anyway, right?
Right. And often that happens when things are going the right way. Additional gifts of art or additional gifts of money come because of that.
They do come. Actually, after I hate to say this, but after my story ran, it ran in the Wall Street Journal, and you know, for the Worcester Art Museum to get national press was really important for them. And after my story ran, he said potential donors came out and wanted to meet with him. So those things do tend to snowball.
So we can say that a different approach from just bringing people in for events can also have a snowball effect and can add to the profile of the museum in the area.
Yes.
So, one other thing that we had talked about earlier was you travel a lot and visit lots of cities, and I'm curious to know, when you go to, say, you're in a city and you have an extra hour, or you're laid over because of bad weather in Seattle, and you decide you're going to go to the art museum. What do you look for? What kind of what's interesting to you?
Well, this is a roundabout way of getting to another thing about museums and why people might want to go to museums. I go most of the time to the permanent collections because I want to see what is specific to that museum. And unfortunately today, maybe in the past too, I don't know, I should look that up, but particularly today with contemporary art, there's a lot of copycat collecting. Everybody has a Warhol, everybody has a Judd, everybody has a, you name it, a Rauschenberg if they can get one, a Johns, whatever. Not enough museums are developing a specialty that would make you want to go and see their specialty. But those who are, I think, do better than those who are cookie cutter museums, because why would I, from New York, go see a museum that has, I can see better here. But I can tell you that this has only really happened once, when I went to Minneapolis to the Walker Art Center several years ago. I walked in the door and I said, "What do you think I should see?" And they immediately directed me to the special exhibition. I said, "No, I meant what should I see in your permanent collection?" They didn't know. The only place where the people knew where but they're not the only place that has special collections, by the way, was when I went to Cincinnati several years ago, and I said, literally, I have 1 hour between now and when I need to go to the airport to catch my plane. What should I see? And the smart women at the information desk directed me to their collection of Ohio art, Cincinnati regional art that was unique to them. Nobody else has it. I didn't spend my whole time there, but if I didn't see it there, I wasn't going to see it anywhere else. And I've recently been in Milwaukee, which has a fabulous, fabulous folk art exhibition up right now. And that's something that it's all from their permanent collection. That's something that they began to specialize on kind of by accident, going back to 30 or so years, because somebody gave them 3 pieces of folk art. And they turned it into a specialty to the point where recently Lanford Wilson, who has no connection to Milwaukee whatsoever but did collect folk art, gave his collection to the Milwaukee Art Museum because he thought that that's where it would get the kind of attention that it needs. So I think building up a specialty also helps build up audiences.
Thank you. So we don't want to forget all of the rest of the audience out here, and so I'd like to pause at least for a few minutes to see if we have any questions specifically related to this part of our discussion. Yes.
I actually have a comment. I'm from Minnesota, so I happen to the Walker Art Museum. You should have just turned around and walked out to the art park, because the art park is probably the best collection of sculpture art, especially since it's weathered so much over time, and the fact that it's still standing is amazing.
Oh, that's good thought. But isn't it interesting that they didn't recommend that?
It is. There is some very interesting stuff in that museum, as well as in their sister museum, I think, in the same area, the Minneapolis Institute of Art.
And I had been there already. I didn't ask that question. I kind of figured I was going to go through the whole Minneapolis art. Very different. Sorry.
Well, I also want to make a little bit of a comment, because I agree with you that the percentage of the tickets is a very small part of the budget. But anytime these museums go out to donors or to get grants, I mean, they do have to talk about their visitor numbers. So it is a little bit bigger than just saying, the door, what's at the door, right? I mean, it is a number that is very important to them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I will say this, and that is the connection to foundations is also rather overdrawn. They care about it, but I think overall museum funding from foundations is also very small, less than 10%, and they sometimes are pushier than some of the other donors, and I'm not sure that museums should allow that to happen. Some individual donors unquestionably care about audience too. There's no question about that. It really, I think, based on my experience and my reporting, it really varies from museum to museum though. I do think, I will agree on this, I think it's getting more important. Again, because I hate to blame the media, but I think the media is more focusing on attendance now too. I remember, it must have been about 15 years ago when the art newspaper first began to do the annual numbers that it does now on special exhibitions, and it didn't even do overall museum attendance to begin with. Now it does that as well. So and that gets picked up, and I write about it sometimes too. So I think there is a little bit of the media driving that, and therefore now that the numbers are public, sometimes some donors are paying more attention to them.
So you spoke of museums establishing habits in their visitors, and this balance between there's the activities that seem like a distraction. The director commenting on people going into even the education wing not really counting as going into the galleries, and these sort of activities where visitors will more and more expect the activities. But then you also, on the other hand, applauded sort of these activities in the galleries in terms of music. What is the right balance of the hook and then allowing people to sort of continue onward?
Well, I want to just clarify something. The reason I applauded the music in the galleries, the preaching in the galleries, is because it was related to the art. It was music of the period that the art was being displayed on. It was preachers who were talking about lessons from the religious paintings that were on view. So that's different than just throwing up the dance band on a Saturday night. And so what was the other part of your question?
Just sort of, does that then lead to visitors always expecting that, those kind of experiences?
Oh, you mean the ones I was talking about that I think are related to the art? Well, I don't think it does, but even if it does, it wouldn't bother me so much because it is about the art. The activities that museums are staging in so many instances now have nothing to do with their collections or art. And that's what I think it's dangerous for one thing, because art museums are never going to be able to compete with entertainment venues. And to even raise the expectation that they could is, again, mistraining your audience. That's not what they should be going to a museum for.
I have a question about, you've been talking about visitors in general. So, is there a difference, and I would assume there would be, about appealing to the community, which I feel like this is more what we're talking about, versus maybe visitors that are just visiting the city? And then how do you reconcile that with, like, do you appeal to different audiences at the same time through these events, or?
I have to clarify, through events, I was
Or
considering.
not, or like events in the gallery, like these things.
I don't think there are very many museums around the country that have a large tourist component. And I think the Met, obviously New York City museums do, some of the LA museums do. But I think even if you looked at museums like Boston or the Art Institute of Chicago, or certainly museums like Kansas City, the Nelson Atkins, St. Louis, Denver, Seattle, they don't have a very big tourist component. And so I don't think they're programming for tourists. And I don't think actually the New York City museums program for tourists. I just think the tourists come because they're wonderful things to see.
We talked a lot about the museum training the audience, but is it really the other way around, where it's the audience that's reflecting upon the museum, but the museum's like, oh, I have to be the cool place, bring in the audience?
Well, I think that's happening, and I think it's a very bad thing. You're going to get me on my hobby horse now. I want to read you something that just happened recently. Has anybody been following the Indianapolis Museum of Art? They just hired somebody to be the audience experiences and performance curator. And here is the director and CEO Charles Venables saying why he did it. He said he created the audience experiences and performance position to help the museum keep pace with what the public wants. That's a quote unquote. What was the track record of the guy they hired from the Walker Art Center? But maybe he belonged at the Walker Art Center. There's a difference between that kind of a museum and the Indianapolis Museum. His track record at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis includes the surprise success of the Internet Cat Video Festival, which brought 10,000 people together in a field, that's open field, in 2012, and then 11,000 paying customers at the 2013 Minnesota State Fair. I think it's crazy. I think it's crazy. I actually think that is an ethical issue. If Charles Venable really thinks that the public should be determining what he does at the museum, I really think he's got it backwards.
I just want to kind of put a slightly different wrinkle on this. You're talking a lot about art museums, but that's of course itself a relatively small percentage of museums, and you know better than I do that in this country, a very large number of very small historic houses and small historical societies. Don't you think that for them it's a little different, and for them to stay alive, I mean, organizing some kind of event is more
I do think it's different. As I said at the very beginning, my focus is much more on art museums. Substitute the word collections for other kinds of museums. Historic houses right now, I think, are in terrible trouble, and I think we have too many of them. I think we have oversupply, and I don't think that all of them are going to survive because we're just not that interested in history anymore. And it's very interesting. It hasn't run yet, but I actually did a story on historic houses for a magazine, which is going to run it sometime this year. And I really familiarized myself with more than 100 of the best historic houses around the country, ones that I would recommend. And even some of them, they're the best, are really having trouble and doing things like, I don't know, and these aren't necessarily bad, but they're doing things like, Halloween night sleepovers or haunted houses or, things like that, because the audience just isn't there for them. But I don't think it's bad if some of them close down. I mean, that's capitalism, isn't it?
But in that case, don't you also think that there is some more value in that? These museums have a slightly different role. They are the history of the community. They are should be more of a kind of a community place.
Well, I think that what you're saying, yes, I'm not comparing them with art museums. And I think even within art museums, there is a taxonomy, if you want to use that word. There are museums which really are about, in my opinion, they're really about the collections. They're really about being a repository for art, the care, the preservation, all of the educational things that we know about. And I would actually make a distinction with art centers, because I think art centers around the country have a different mission. And I think many of them don't have collections or don't have big collections, and I think that they have a different mission, and they can be more community focused because of what they actually own or what they set out to be. But I don't think, I agree with you that there's different kinds of museums have different roles to play and they must adopt different kinds of strategies, yes.
And as we've said many times as we've been talking about this conversation tonight, that it really all depends upon mission and what is appropriate, for example, for a historical house museum, a historical society is very different sometimes than what's appropriate for an art museum. Certainly when I was at the New Jersey Historical Society, we were very conscious of the fact that we needed to relate to our community in a lot of different ways, and through programming, through our exhibitions, through allowing people opportunities to come to convene, to talk about issues that were important to them. But because we were a historical society, we were about identity and about the sort of civic responsibility, and we could do that very legitimately within our mission. So it's a very different kind of thing. Alyssa, did you have a question?
I did. I just wanted to ask you what personal recommendations or strategies do you have for museums to help condition visitors to be more interested in the permanent collections rather than the blockbuster exhibitions and the special exhibitions they put on?
I think it really varies from museum to museum, and you have to deal with what you have. Even Worcester, which has a great collection, isn't the Met and has to adopt a different strategy than the Met, and it has to adopt a different strategy than, say, Denver. But okay, we were talking about Denver earlier this evening. Denver is in a very family-oriented town. They have a lot of family programming and family activities based around the art, though. It's based about the art, and that's the key to me. There is no one-size-fits-all strategy. You have to look at your collections, you have to look at your community, but make it about the core. Make it about the art.
Just going back a little bit to the mention of the audience experience curator and the idea that perhaps the audience is training the museum. I wonder if you could speak a little to the fact that in sort of tough economic times, museums and other nonprofits are being encouraged to function more like a business, and that how basically are these market forces that are
who do you think is pushing them in that direction?
I kind of think it's a combination of forces, of market forces, audience, cultural forces.
See, I think a lot of it is internal. I think a lot of it is wanting to be, popular, wanting to be seen as a kind of a hip place to be, and I think that all nonprofits are businesses, but that doesn't mean they have to be run like businesses in the exact same way that a business is. They have insulation from some market forces. Their donor base gives them that, among other things. And I actually I'm not sure where the impetus is coming from. I think a lot of it is coming from internally. Oops. Are you going to not be part of our conversation? I thought this was a conversation. What do you have anything to say?
Not on that one.
Okay.
On the lines of the market, how a lot museums have traditionally been a market, like at least currently they're now for a market for an older generation. The more older individuals are going into museums, looking at museums, and they're the attendees. How should a museum then market to the younger people? Is it through family-oriented programs? Is it through youth-oriented programs? Or is it through the dance parties where they get people to see that the museum isn't the scary place that they thought it was?
Oh, wow. First of all, I think it's definitely through the first two and definitely not for the last one. Because first of all, I mean, this always bothers me. How can teenagers or young people who are willing to go clubbing in Manhattan and stay out till 4 a.m. find a museum intimidating? I mean, isn't it more intimidating to be on the streets of Lower Manhattan in the dark at 4 a.m. with, I just think that's a false analysis. I don't understand why people would find museums intimidating. Go in, if you don't like it, leave. But why is that intimidating? So I don't buy that thing. But on the first part of your question, I think it's all of them. I think again, you have to be attentive to your community. I think that there are some communities like Denver where family programming is really, really important. I think in New York, I think maybe Brooklyn probably has more families and probably should be doing some more family programming than it is. The Met does, but I don't think it needs to overemphasize programming because its audience is, as I mentioned in the moment two, I don't know the number for sure, but a very large percentage is international tourists and American tourists too. So it doesn't have to overemphasize family programming, but I think you have to know who you're, and I don't want to call them a target audience because I think your target should be universal. Everybody should be interested in, I don't want to put that. Everybody should have the opportunity to visit museums. They should feel accessible to everybody. But I don't think that museums have to slice and dice their audiences and devise something for every single, kind of constituency out there.
Other questions? Well, I was actually going to say, I'm one of those people who was intimidated by museums when I was young. So we talked about this as well. But when I was growing up, I went to the local art museum and couldn't find any, even though I was interested in art and I wanted to go there. No one was forcing me. It wasn't with a class. It was just going. I went and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to look at the pictures. I hadn't had any, this was when I was still maybe in high school, if I was old at that point. And I'm sure that I tried more than once, but I ended up not liking museums for a long time as a result of that because the museum didn't help me. It made me, I used to leave feeling dumber than when I walked in the door. So I can understand people being intimidated by a museum. And I know that what I didn't find when I went in was anything, I didn't find labels that told me what I was looking at. I didn't find anything that gave me a clue of how to look at what was on the walls. I just found it a really uncomfortable experience, and I didn't know how to act either.
And yet, well, that's another thing, and yet, many people think that the labels that people are given in museums are too much or really didactic. You know, the museum labels are now down to what, 75 words? Is that common? Or 150 words at most, where they used to be much longer than that, because people don't want they don't want to be told how to feel about art. And yet I agree with you. I mean, even the Worcester Museum showed that. He took away the labels right next to him because he wanted people to focus on the art. The labels were right over on a placard in the center or on the side, and people wanted it right there. But that's because we trained them to have it right there in a way. They may bring them back there, but I actually even sorry to parse words here, but name it and frame it. I'm not even sure that what you felt was intimidation, really. Maybe it wasn't a connection, but that's not the same as intimidation. And I think it's important. Words are important. So if you felt no connection, then that's a different problem than if you felt intimidated.
I think it was a little bit of both, actually, and this was before labels were long. This was when labels were only the artist and the name of the painting, and that was it. And they didn't even tell you anything about the artist. So it was, I think, for me, it was a lack of information, and then, and this is probably a personal psychological problem, but deciding that because I didn't know anything, and they didn't tell me anything, that it was my problem that I didn't know about it, and therefore, who knows what. But anyway, but I did find that I found the experience really intimidating, and was turned off by museums or at least by art museums for a long time, until I began to see that there were different models of operating that made me feel like that helped me look at the art, helped me understand what was going on.
Well, all I can say to that is that, for you who felt no connection because you weren't told enough, there were probably people who felt that they were being pushed to see something that they didn't see. And so I think it's a balance that I wasn't at your museum, so I don't know what they did, but I don't think there's like one universal answer, because people are different.
Yeah, which is, I think, one of the reasons that museums now are trying to, many museums try to appeal to a lot of different ways of looking at art, and a lot of different ways of learning about art in the institutions. So, just to take up one other subject before we end, the newspapers have been full lately of articles about about de-accessioning art, whether it's the Detroit Museum of Art, which has faced the possibility of de-accessioning because of the bankruptcy of the city, the Randolph College de-accessioning. Do you see these cases as instances of that we can learn from? Are these cases where people are de-accessioning or being forced to the point of de-accessioning or thinking about de-accessioning because of the economy, or are we talking about other issues?
I don't think either one of those cases is typical, and I don't think we learn all that much from them, about museums, because in neither case was the museum at fault. It was Randolph College, of which Mayor is part of, that needs the money, not the museum. And I think they made a bad call, but as far as I know, the museum itself was doing fine, thank you very much, but they weren't in control of their own collection. And the same thing with the DIA. After very, very hard battle to get tax revenue, but previously a very successful capital campaign where they raised more than $350 million at a time when the city was shrinking dramatically, and wealthy people were leaving, although the counties obviously have some wealth. It was the city itself that was bankrupt, not something the museum management was responsible for. So I really think that those are two outliers in the de-accessioning discussion.
At the same time, though, they both bring up the idea of art as an asset as opposed to, I mean, a financial asset. And it seems like that's becoming more, people are focusing on that more and more. I had a conversation at lunch one day with someone from the financial world who said, sell it. Why does Detroit need, I mean, Detroit needs the money. They've got assets, they should get rid of them. And could not see the value of art as being anything greater than the dollar sign that it would bring at an auction. So it's, I think that these cases have sort of highlighted the fact that art can be very valuable and can bring in revenue for institutions that might be in trouble. And I think it brings up the, what is the value of art? Is it financial or is it something greater?
You're getting to some questions which I can't answer in the next 5 minutes, but art has always had value, and the fact that the contemporary art market in particular right now is very hot has certainly put it in the headlines and made people more aware of the kind of money that people are spending to buy art. I don't think there's anything museums can do about that. As a matter of fact, many of them are at a loss too. I mean, so many museums that would like to own, say, Gerhard Richter and never bought one when he was reasonable can no longer afford him. And they're definitely dependent on, for getting things like his and other kinds of contemporary art on collectors more than they have been in the past, which is pretty dependent. But I don't think museums can do anything about that. I think they have to stand by and defend their, first of all, they have to be well managed and make sure that they are well managed and that they've got, they're not running losses, because they themselves should be in control of their own destiny and not want a de-accession if they're well managed. And then they have to make the distinction, which I don't think it's really all that hard to make the distinction. I know a lot of people disagree with it, but that doesn't mean that, this is a free country, you can say what you want. That doesn't mean that what they say rules.
Can I just pick up on that? I still think that, for example, in the case of colleges that have wanted to de-accession their collection, have art museums thought hard enough and done enough to really prove, or not prove, but to kind of convey that the value that there is in them inherently, which is of course a very difficult thing to show, but I think they could do more.
I agree with you, and actually this is another element in the art versus entertainment. The more museums become entertainment, the less special they become, and the less we can defend art as something that is inviolate and can't be sold to raise money to pay for operations.
Other questions?
Going back to your previous talk about labels and labeling and the inclusion of iPads in the Weiser collection?
The Worcester collection?
Yes.
The Worcester collection, yeah.
Worcester collection. How do you think museums should use technology like iPads and touchscreens within their collection, integrated with like the labels and stuff, to get people more involved and more interested in the art, so they're not sitting there wondering, what is this art, how do I look at it, or something?
Sally would have much less trouble today wandering around an art museum, because there are so many other ways. And in all honesty, I don't have an answer for that, because I think we're in this stage where we're trying a lot of things out. I did try out, has anybody been to MoMA and tried out the iPads that they hand out for exhibitions? Anybody done that yet? No, you have, yeah, okay, did you like it? Aspect, me too. I was going to say, so what this is they give you an iPad and you can choose the work of art that you want, and you can get more information. You can take a picture of it, and you can, and then later on you can get a an email of your itinerary and your pictures emailed to you when you go home you can see it. I think they must have found me really weird because not only was I taking pictures of the paintings, I was taking pictures of the labels because I wanted the information. And I didn't see very many other people taking pictures of the labels. You were?
No, that's a pretty common thing. That's something I've documented.
Oh, really?
Is taking pictures of labels, and so thinking about how to make that information more available, because people get too tired standing there reading, and they want to be able to look at it.
Exactly, they want to look at it at home. So I liked that particular app. I don't know how well it's doing. I think MoMA is committed to it. At the same time, and I haven't seen this, there's the Gallery 1, they call it, at Cleveland. Has anybody been to Gallery 1 in Cleveland? What you do is, you have. Oh, so tell us, is it good?
Yeah, it's just fantastic to interact with. I have not taken the iPad around. I didn't have one with
So you just went, what it is there's a big gallery off to the left, I think, of the entrance, and you go in there and there's a big wall with all of the things that are on you, and you pick the ones you want, and you can make your own itinerary on the iPad they give you, and then they direct you to see the art that you particularly work. So you didn't go around to the art afterwards, you just played with the wall?
Yeah, because the wall itself is fascinating because you can pull up any piece in the collection, and it will tell you more information about the art, where to find it, and then there are visitor curated tours that other visitors have collected their favorite art together, and so you could find someone else's collection that they really like, and then you could go see that.
Yeah. So those are just two examples, and I know that many other museums are trying different ones, but I think we're still at the very early stage of what it is that we want from technology at museums, and it may always be a menu of many things. I don't know, but it's too early to say. I think a lot of it is good. I think some of it is distracting. I don't particularly like the ones at the Met in the period rooms. Has anybody been in the American period rooms at the Met? They just have these things where big kind of screens where you scroll and get information about stuff that's sitting right in front of you. I'd rather, it's like a big label on a screen. It doesn't do anything for me. But I think the other ones that are more innovative are much more interesting. Has anybody else got examples of where they've seen technology that's really helpful, educational? Yeah, okay. Walker.
I think it was at the Chicago Art Institute or the Institute of Art. I can't remember what it was. But they do have these little iPads that are connected to strings right in front of a collection of art, and you can learn a little bit more about the time period, a bit more about the artist, as well as a bit you can interact with the artwork, and you can zoom in on certain pieces that they don't have out and that are actually in storage, but they aren't able to bring out. So it was kind of interesting because I saw a couple kids just hanging around them, just fascinated by the technology, and I think that allows them to be a little bit more interested in the art because they're like, oh wow, this is cool, this is artwork, but I'm also playing with technology, which I can't do at home.
Yes, at the same time, yeah. Okay. Yep.
Well, I have to defend the Brooklyn Museum. It's my favorite museum, as I think they do a whole lot of things extremely well. And in their mummy room, you can, there's interactive stuff. You can completely unwrap the mummy, and come all the way to the core of the mummy. There's all kinds of really cool stuff. So, I think that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I don't want to give the impression that I think the Brooklyn Museum is doing everything wrong. I don't. I do think they're overly reliant on getting attendance from first Saturdays. But I think that given the atmosphere that that Brooklyn is working in, with so many Manhattan museums that people from Manhattan won't cross the bridge to go over there to see, and other things, lack of much less funding, much less funding in Brooklyn than there is in Manhattan. I think a lot of what he does is very good. And I'll tell you one instance where they had good technology also in Brooklyn. I don't know if any of you went to see the show of John Singer Sargent watercolors about a year ago, I think it was. They had very little, unobtrusive, no bigger than this, I think, screens showing where they hired a local artist and they didn't put her face on the screen or anything. They just showed techniques that Sargent used. You know, how he used the wax system to create white, and how he did other techniques in watercolors. They were very unobtrusive. You didn't have to look if you didn't want to. But they were very useful to people learning about the techniques that Sargent and other watercolor painters used.
Okay, any other comments or experiences to share? One last question. What about in the past couple of years, the Met has been doing some really interesting things online. They've had their 82nd and 5th series, and then they just started a new series.
They now have at least 3 or 4 series, and I think some are better than others. I think some are very short. They're the ones that I've heard complaints about. They're less than 2 minutes, and the curator barely gets something said when it's time to end it. But I think that people do like 82nd and 5th, and the one that just started, and I'm sorry, I blogged about it the other day, but I can't remember what it's called, is very good. Well, I like it, not everybody likes it. It is usually 2 parts, although one of them only has 1 part, and it consists of a slideshow with as many as 27 or 28 slides about the work of art under consideration, which you can either put on automatic, and it gives you 4 seconds, I timed it to look at each slide, or you can manually do it yourself. And then on the next tab there is a curator, or I think they were both curators. One is Keith Christensen talking about a painting, and he talks for about 5 minutes or so, 4 or 5 minutes, to tell more about the background of the work of art. But it's very accessible, and what I liked about it was, you do it if you want to. You don't have to look at every one of the 27 slides, or you can put them on automatic. And I think it had, Keith Christensen is just a very good, curator, and told so much interesting background about this particular portrait that I thought it was really very engaging.
Do you see any future for using these kinds of things in the museum itself, or do you think these are just other ways of accessing information that the museum has in its vast warehouse?
I'm an old fogey, so I like them best online and not in the galleries, but I'm open to it in the galleries. I think it really just depends on how they're designed and how well they're designed. I mean, one of the best websites that I think is still great, although I haven't been there in a while, so I hope it still works. Does anybody remember the Mourners exhibition at the Met about 3 years ago? It was these medieval alabaster, I think they were mourners from a tomb the tomb was being reconstructed in France, and so they sent them over here on a 7 or 8 museum tour, and the Met lined them all up beautifully, like in a mourner's procession in the medieval hall, and then put a couple of its own related works around it. But the best part was that the consortium, I think that did it, created this website of that had each one of them, and you could rotate them around, zoom in, so that you could get much closer to the artwork than you could, even though the Met didn't have any stanchions or anything, and you could get pretty close in the medieval hall. And it was just really fascinating look at these sculptures that are normally in a niche, so normally you can't even see the back of them. And now, since they were out while the tomb was being cleaned and all that, we had a view of these things that was just fantastic. If they had a few of those in the galleries, I think it would have been that would have been interesting.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? So thank you very much. Yeah.